Welcome to episode, we're going to call this -5 of the Film Muse podcast. Really not sure what I'm doing. So I'm calling this -5 as a way to give myself a little room for improvement, a little room to learn and see exactly what works best and what doesn't work best. So apologies if it's a little bit rough here. I'm making my way and trying to figure out what is going to be the best course of action when doing these recordings here. So I think the first thing to say is, well, how is this going to be formatted? My idea right now is that this is going to be a double feature episode. So that's something that maybe, that's a cool way to actually have different episodic things. One's called a double feature, where I'm going to talk about two different movies. But I think most podcasts will focus on one movie specifically, and it won't deviate from that. But who knows, right? This is -5. We're pre-podcast staging, essentially. This is a way for me to practice and get the words that I am saying down. And I think something that I really would like to do is, of course, put in a good amount of production quality into these video and audio recordings here. That's very important to me. But I think something that is missing from video essays or any sort of video content that's put on YouTube is the idea of a continuous shot. You often see a lot of cuts. Sometimes they're invisible cuts, but they're still pretty visible. And I would rather be authentic. I don't want to put in filler. Don't get me wrong. There's no reason to put in words for the sake of words. That being said, I think it shows a different level of skill to be able to orate and just speak without having too much canned or too much prepared. Now, I certainly am not going to tell you that I'm going into this without any sort of notes. That's just simply not true. My first movie that I'm going to be talking about here is a movie that I rewatched. So when I rewatched it, I was taking notes the whole time to make sure that I had my thoughts down for this podcast. I didn't want to go into it blind and without the proper knowledge. So if you ever see me looking down or something like that, I'm looking at my notes to make sure that I am talking about the things that I wanted to talk about. But that will mostly be for movies that are rewatches. Anything that's new, I'm not going to take notes on because it's a new experience. I feel like that would take me out of it if I was just constantly on my phone typing something away. And I just don't think that that's the best way to watch a movie for the first time. Certainly not saying you can't do that, just maybe not the best experience for you to have. Also, looks like I'm peaking a little bit, so I'm going to turn the knob a little bit less on the gain. See, this is why it's -5 here. I'm trying to figure out the audio levels and see what's going to work best. But with this double feature episode today, what we're going to be talking about is a rewatch, as I alluded to, as well as a brand new watch. That rewatch movie is 1983's Scarface, directed by Brian De Palma. And then the recent movie that I watched, a new one, is Godzilla Minus One, which came out at the tail end of 2022. I'm not sure of the director, and that's okay. So it's going to be two very different things that we'll be talking about on today's podcast. I am going to have to break these segments up into different parts, as I want there to be a natural transition. I also am not accustomed to talking for all this time at a camera, and I need to train myself up a little bit before I get to that point where I am fully going for an hour or so, however long the podcast may be. I'm looking at the time right now. It's a little close to 6 minutes, so 5:40. We just hit that mark with removing some stuff at the beginning. So it's going to be a process, and I'm looking forward to what that process is going to teach me. So if you're here now, it's pretty crazy. There's nothing else here except for the intro video. So thanks for being here, I guess. Hopefully you like the content, but we will jump right into it. Normally, I think I would make a little cut here and add in the segment for Scarface, introing it maybe with some clips or something like that. But for starters, we will simply go into Scarface. So here's your transition point. Maybe I cut the audio here. We'll see. But I first watched Scarface circa 2013, 2014. My records on it are not very clear. That's partially because I was between logging movies on both Facebook and IMDb, which is quite the mess, if you ask me, to be able to manage both of those. So I'm not really sure when I watched it. All I know is that I was a young adolescent at the time, and to watch a movie like that is one that really enriches your movie knowledge, because you see such prolific acts and prolific nature of the world that you're not familiar and accustomed with, at least not me when I was that age. So it's a movie that definitely left a really strong impact on me. So strong that I know I had Scarface for a very long time as the #1 movie on my list. Now, I still consider this movie to be within my top 10, which is saying a lot. I gave it 9 out of 10 stars back in the day, 4.5 out of 5, whichever scale you use. And after that rewatch, I can certify exactly the score that I gave. I have no qualms with changing my scores, but I truly do believe that this score was correct and honest. Me back then, I still seemingly knew what I was talking about, because this movie is an absolute epic, all 2 hours and 40 minutes of it. So I think the things that make this movie so interesting in nature are, of course, the characters that play a part, the screenwriting and the script that exists, but also the destination, the landscape, the background that we are in of 1980s Miami. It's so very iconic for the 80s, and to have a story based in that is very, very cool, in my opinion. Now, something I probably should have introed before, and see, this is why this is a learning process here, but something I should have introed before my reviews here. I'm not going to go over plot synopses of these movies. So if you have not seen Scarface before and you have the intention of watching it, feel free to stop listening, stop watching, and go ahead and watch it, because I'm going to give you things that stood out to me in this movie, especially because it was a rewatch. I'm not going to hash through every little thing that happened in the movie. These are the things that left an impact on me this time, the second time around. But if you don't want anything spoiled, now's the time to click away. So there's forewarning here and an idea of how these are going to be structured in the future. So I think looking at the backdrop of Miami, and of course, like any movie, you have to know that there is the suspension of disbelief with everything that happens. You look at the streets of Miami, and according to Scarface, they are crime-ridden, with guys out there selling yayo wherever they want, and that is clearly truthful in a way to the time period, but it's not the truth. There are some creative liberties that have been taken by De Palma, and we, the audience member, have to find the way to suspend that disbelief to continue the story. And on the subject of continuing the story, I think this is a movie that just doesn't stop, which is a really great thing. You have scenes that are slower, that are just people talking about maybe making deals, maybe about how they love each other. It doesn't really matter what the scene is. There's always forward momentum and progress being made. And I think that's really important for a movie, especially of this length, with 160 minutes of runtime, because if you have those scenes that are just filler and they're there because you're trying to pad the script a little bit, the audience is going to get bored and they're not going to want this. And I think an important part of Scarface is that there is no downtime. There is no boredom that can be had because every single scene that exists is important and progresses the story forward. Now, I would go almost as far as to say that this movie is pretty much perfectly paced. I can't think of a way that you could have cut this down and kept all of the details that you need. Of course, there are things that you could cut here and there. One less meeting, one less romantic encounter. But I think that those are important and they play a good role in the story of Tony Montana. So let's dive into Tony Montana a little bit as a character. For those of you who don't know, and I did know this going into my second watch here, this was not news to me, but Scarface is actually a remake of a 1921. Don't hold me to that date. I could be very wrong about that. I think it was in the 20s, but a 1921 remake, or this is a remake of the 1921 movie of the same name, which focused on a character that's not Al Capone, but is Al Capone. When we look at Tony Montana, it's very clear that he is not Al Capone. He is his own man, and he is very distinctly Cuban. Al Pacino's portrayal of Tony Montana is one that's just completely immersive. When I watched this movie, at no point, besides maybe the first scene in interrogation room, do I ever think to myself, oh yeah, that's Al Pacino on the screen. I am fully buying into this. Is Tony Montana. This is his own. This is the man. He is the man in this movie, and you can feel his presence in every scene that he is in. Not only because he's in mostly every scene portrayed, but he is strong. He is a force to be reckoned with, even when he's just sitting there. So Al Pacino truly solidified my love for him when I watched this movie because of his portrayal of Tony. Now, I am no linguistics expert by any means. There's no way for me to verify whether or not his Cuban accent is spot on or just a pantomime of what Cuban speaking is like. That being said, I totally buy it. And that could just be my dumb brain that likes the accent, but I think it works really well with his characterization of Tony Montana, and I very much buy into the whole thing. So there's no complaints on my end for anything that Al Pacino does. I think one of the, I don't know if it's the craziest thing that happens in this movie from Tony's perspective. There's a lot of crazy stuff that happens, but the scene in the shower where Tony is, he essentially knows he's going to die. He has almost not committed, but accepted the fact that this is it for him. The deal went bad with the Colombians, and he is going to die in this shower next to his friend, cut up by a chainsaw. And he just goes limp. There's just this nature of dread that overcomes him, and he's just there. They're pushing a gun up to his face, and he is just not having it. He's not willing to give them anything, even though he owes nothing to Omar at all for the Yayo. He refuses to tell them where the money is. Now, I think that that's something that shows who Tony is as a person. He's not just this random low-level street thug. He is someone that cares, and someone who is passionate, someone who is not willing to just be mulled over because a deal didn't go his way. I think that's important because we see that later in the movie, in which Tony sticks to his morals and abides by them with everything that he does. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But I think, just looking at my notes here, it was really funny being able to see, what's his name? Oh my goodness, I'm not remembering. F. Murray Abraham. A little mind slip there. F. Murray Abraham. I certainly didn't remember him in the role of Omar here, so it was very fun to see him, especially because I had watched Amadeus relatively recently. I believe in November is when I first watched it, and it was just the duality of man, the two roles that he could play. Very, very interesting in my opinion. But when he walks away from Tony towards Frank at one point, and then Tony just says this quote about like this guy, and it was exactly what I was thinking in my head as soon as he walked away. I thought that that was really good, and the dialogue that is provided here, sure, it's delivered by every character differently according to their character, but I think it's natural. It doesn't feel canned or silly. It feels like something people would actually say, which is really good. So the really important scene towards the first third of the movie is when Tony is talking with Elvira and Frank in the club, and they give him two rules. And the first rule we have there is to don't underestimate the other guy's greed. So that right there is a very important rule, because you always want to remain sharp when you're on top. And getting soft, not exactly the way to succeed. And the second rule that Elvira provides in a sort of, not sarcastic, but a manner in which she can't be bothered to hear Frank say this again to another low-level man, is don't get high on your own supply. Something I'm sure most of us have heard, whether it be in a joke or throughout our life. I think that there's a third message here or a third lesson rather, that isn't presented by the two of them. And that first one is to not mix business with pleasure, because we see how that affects events later in the movie, in which I will certainly go into. But I think those three messages are important to take away from this movie, especially if you're in the drug trade. But just for life, you can look at those three things and apply them, manipulate them into certainly more legal methods. But I think that there is truth to all three of those lessons that are presented here. So we can also see how Tony, later in the movie, actually breaks that. I think the relationship between Tony and Elvira is a very interesting one. I found it very funny, actually, the scene in which he's about to purchase the car. They go back to they go back to Tony's car with Elvira, and he puts on her hat. Michelle Pfeiffer's laugh in that scene was legitimate because it was not scripted. It was just impromptu, created by Pacino. So it was a pretty funny scene just to see that in the movie, and they kept that in. But I think Tony's confidence and his swagger throughout the movie is just something that is so captivating. The fact that he saw Elvira in that glass elevator from the first scene and decided that she was the one. She was the one. And who knows if it's because that Tony was in love with her at first sight, if he just lusted for her, or if it was a power thing. He saw that she was Frank's girl, and now he wanted her for himself. It's not clear, and I don't think it needs to be clear. Regardless of that, Tony set his mind on Elvira, and he got what he wanted. He made sure of it. So there's a line in there that says, Elvira says to Tony, she says, "Don't call me baby, I'm not your baby." And Tony just says to her, "Not yet." And that right there is that's so strong. It shows how strong of a character is, even though he may not have the standing of Frank. He may not have the cachet of someone else that's higher up, like a Sosa. He controls his own destiny, and he's very clear about that. Not yet. There's a lot of things he could have said, but not yet is just a very strong line to deliver. And now, there's a scene where he's talking to Manny about Elvira, and he's saying to Manny that she wants him, and he says to her, "The eyes, Manny, they never lie. They never lie." And that line right there is very important, because we see Manny's eyes never lie as well in this movie. Manny is not necessarily in love with Gina, but the moment that he sees Gina, he is certainly interested in her. And you know that scene where Tony just chastises him. I love that scene in the car, going on a bit of a tangent here, because Tony, as soon as he hears Manny suggest the thought of Gina and him together, the music changes real quick. It becomes sharp. It becomes deep. We see Tony's whole demeanor change, and he says to Manny, he's like, "You can never, ever, ever think about that, ever." And that is really important. Just by saying she's beautiful. He didn't even say that he wanted to go take her on a date. All he said was that Gina was beautiful, and Tony was pissed. Tony absolutely, just that ball of anger inside of him that his kid's sister was being looked at like that just was released, and the rage. And that was all portrayed in the music as well, which is a really good job with the score there. So, moving on with this movie, there's a point in which at the dealership scene, Tony goes and he's walking out to the car, and he hits his head on a piece of metal or tubing that was hanging from a lift. I don't know if that was scripted or not. I couldn't find anything on it, but that was pretty cool that they kept that in. Just a little more of the naturalness of the movie. It makes it feel like it's real. And now there's the first scene in which Tony, Omar, and Sosa are sitting in a courtyard trying to discuss a deal for the Yayo and how they could possibly get that to the United States, how far Sosa is going to go, how far Frank will be willing to go. And there's this scene in which Tony is a very distinct person that is not from this ilk of man, if you will. Sosa is a very well relaxed and well dressed person. He's sitting there knowing that he holds essentially all of the cards on the table here. And Omar is there, just very proper, very up straight, willing to talk to Sosa and give him the respect that he earns. Meanwhile, Tony is there with his shirt probably open a little too far than it should be for a business meeting like this, and eating his salad, which neither Sosa nor Omar are eating their salads, but Tony's eating his salad with the fork upside down, so the prongs are like this, and he's just stabbing stuff, putting it in his mouth, and just eating and talking like that. And that right there is a very small detail that I don't think people would necessarily pick up on, but that characterization is so good. It's so good because it shows how Tony was living. It shows who he is as a person. He's not this high society rich person. He came from the streets of Cuba, and he's here now, but he didn't shed that identity. That identity is still a part of him and makes him who he is. So that was just a scene that I really loved and stuck out to me because I thought it was great. I thought it was really cool that that was portrayed by Pacino. Whether or not De Palma told him to do that or not, I'm not sure, but I really enjoyed that. And then what a surprise here. Did I remember that Mark Margolis was in this movie? Absolutely not. I didn't even remember Mark Margolis' name. I only knew Margolis, of course, from his infamous role as Hector Salamanca in both the Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul series. But what a surprise to see him here. Younger, yes, but still bald with white hair, surprisingly. It was very cool to see him. He plays a character called the Shadow, if I'm not mistaken. He might have a name that's given in the movie, but I believe he's credited as Shadow. He was very cool to see, and the ruthlessness that he shows at the end of the movie, where he's trying to kill a not diplomat, but someone who's speaking out against the cocaine trade. That was very interesting for his character. So, but what a nice surprise. I have a Letterboxd account, which I'm sure I will continue to mention, not necessarily through this review, but through other reviews. And one of my favorite tags on there is, hey, look, it's that guy from that thing. And that's typically associated with people that I don't necessarily know the actor or actress's name, but I recognize them from this project. And maybe I've seen them in a few things and I'm not really sure who or what they were doing, but I definitely recognize them. In this case, I definitely knew the projects, being Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, but I didn't quite know Mark Margolis' name. So that was just a nice little surprise to see. There's a scene now where Frank and Tony, actually it may not be Frank and Tony. No, it is. It's Frank and, I'm messing up names in my head. It is Tony and the police officer that he is willing to bribe and get him on the payroll, essentially. It's a very, again, this is a very small thing that I liked in this movie, is when the officer mentions that he needs to get paid off. Tony says how much, and all he does is write down on a napkin and show it to Tony. And Tony says, that's a big number. And that's it. We don't see the number. We have no idea how big of a number that is, whether it was $10,000 a month or $50,000 a month. We don't know. And I think that that is a great way to show and not tell. We don't want the officer being very explicit and saying, well, Tony, I need $36,000 a month deposited into my bank account in order for me to... No. That's so boring and so gross. We don't want that in a movie. No one wants that in a movie. What we do want to see is a scene that gives you just enough information, but still leaves you wondering what that value could have been. So I really loved that right there. When Tony's attacked in the club, I think it's really good to show that he's not made of plot armor, that he actually was injured and really barely got out of there. I think that's really good to show a little mortality in your main characters, because in a lot of things that are produced nowadays, there is that heavy plot armor where you know people will not get hurt, people will not die. And sure, the movie's based on Tony Montana, you know he's not going to die in that scene, but it does give perspective that he is just a mortal man, which is really good. After he kills Frank, saying, "You want a job, Ernie?" That's pretty funny. You didn't know what he was going to say, if he was going to kill him or not. It was really good. And then to show how dangerous and how maniacal Tony really is, we get the scene where Elvira's in bed, and all we see that comes into frame is Tony's hand covered in blood to wake her up and caress her face. And that is, oh my goodness, that scene just gets me going. The fact that this man is probably covered in his own blood from getting shot in the club, but also potentially covered in the blood of both the cop and Frank from a little bit of blood spatter. And he just goes there and he says, "You're mine now." That is just so diabolical. And it's just, what a crazy scene that is to see. And these are all small things that stand out to me, but it's the small things that stack up and make that movie that was just great and incredible experience. I think that's really important. I won't talk about too much here. I think there's a lot of great scenes. Once Tony's finally in power, you can see that he falls from power pretty distinctly, where he flips out against Elvira in the restaurant, and he's talking about him being the bad guy. You can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. So what does that make you, the good guys? Certainly a lesson to take away from that movie. This movie is who is good and bad, what is good and evil. I think that is the perspective to take into consideration when looking from both Tony and the person on the outside, those perspectives. But we can see that Tony violates the 3 lessons. Not necessarily Tony, but people within his organization violate those 3 lessons that Frank gave. 2 explicit, 1 non-explicit. The first being never underestimate the other guy's greed. Tony makes a critical miscalculation when killing the Shadow, because Sosa needed him dead. His associates needed him dead, and him being the diplomat / reporter. By killing the Shadow, Tony is not estimating how much Sosa needs him dead. And that's a critical error. It leads to Tony's death. It leads to him getting blown away, as he does from the back. And that shows how he faltered and how he fell from grace. The second one was don't get high on your own supply. Earlier than that scene towards the end, we can see how Tony starts from a perspective of maybe just doing a little bit of yayo to doing a little bit more, and now he's just got, at the end of the movie, he's just got heaps of cocaine on his desk, where he is just so heavily addicted to it. He needs it to function. He needs it to deal with his paranoia, to keep himself sharp, and he violates that second rule that Frank provided him. Well, technically provided by Elvira, who is a little bit ironic coming from her, as she was the one who was called by Tony a junkie, because all she did was sit around all day and do yayo. So, and then that third rule that I provided that wasn't explicitly said was the idea of not mixing business and pleasure. We see Manny come to such an unfortunate end when Tony kills him, because he did exactly that. He took pleasure, which was Gina, Tony's family, and he put that into the business by associating himself with Gina. And that whole encounter was so shocking on my first watch, because you didn't expect it. You didn't expect Tony to outright kill him. The fact that Tony was willing to beat up a man in a stall just for making out with Gina shows that he's unhinged when it comes to his sister. But to kill your best friend, the man who's been through so much with you, who started in this business with you, who's been there for you always, your head of security, and you're not even willing to talk it out. It shows how paranoid Tony is, how he is so protective of his sister, and he's not willing by any means to let anyone get to her. So it's a very strong scene there. I think I don't want to talk about everything that's on this list here. There was a really funny scene which I will probably stick with me for a while, when Tony's in his bubble bath and he's looking at the TVs. He goes, "Oh, look at the pelicans! Pelicans fly!" And they are not pelicans; they are flamingos. But it's pretty funny that he calls them pelicans, whether or not that was Pacino making a mistake, whether it was intentional because of a language barrier between Spanish and English, who knows? But I think that was a very funny scene where he's saying, "Oh, pelicans, pelicans fly." So very, very funny there. So the three things that I think you can take away from this movie are, well, the first one is, it's not really a word, but I'm going to make it a word here, is that money miserates. We see Tony at the start of the film very carefree, this idea that he likes adventure and he is willing to kill a former Communist Party member just because he was a member of the Communist Party, as a favor to those who were asking. That shows how Tony is filled with that spirit and that drive. And towards the end of the movie, we can see once he has that money, he just sort of slouches and doesn't really care for anything anymore, and really just needs to maintain his power. That's all he does. Now that he has it, he has nowhere to go. It was a crazy ride for him to start at the bottom and then make his way slowly up, killing Frank and continuing that climb. But once he's at the top, there's almost nothing left to be achieved but maintaining that presence. And Tony no longer feels that drive, knows what it is to be excited because he has it all. So I think that's one important thing to take away. The second one is that power paranoids. And you can see that just with Tony's counter surveillance cameras, as they're called. But he is always, when he's not high or drunk, he's always caring about security. He's so paranoid, in fact, that's what gets him caught with the authorities. He has to be there to count the money himself. He can't trust someone else to be there. He has to be there. That's something that any sort of drug lord would not be willing to do. They're simply there, and they hire someone to do that for them. And sure, you have to expect an accountant is going to rip you off a little bit, but he's so paranoid, he is not willing to let any sort of leakage through. So that's very interesting. And then the third lesson that I took away from this movie is that no matter how hard you appear to be, no matter how strong you want to seem, your morals will always shine through. And we see this when the Shadow is trying to kill the diplomat slash correspondent. I'm not really sure who that person is, because Tony's unwilling to continue the plot to kill him with the explosive under the car, because his wife and child are in the car. It wasn't part of the plan, and Tony's not willing to kill a woman and a child, regardless of how that messes up his life. And as we see, it very much messes up his life in this movie. But Tony is so strong and feels so passionate about this non-killing that he is willing to take the life of the Shadow as a result. So regardless of anything that you might want to portray yourself as, you're always going to revert back to what you know best. And if that is good, if you know good, then you will always be good. And if you know bad, then you will always be bad. So those are some great things from Scarface here. The history of Scarface, which I'm sure you can go ahead and look up on your own, is quite an interesting one, in my opinion, especially with the ratings board. So give that a check if you want. But overall, Scarface originally at that 9 out of 10, 4.5 out of 5, it maintains that spot right now and does sit within my top 10 list. So you can check out any of that information on Letterboxd. It should be published by the time that this podcast is released. And that's all I have to say on Scarface. It's a really good movie. Check it out, see what you think. And if you disagree or agree with anything, feel free to drop it in the comments below. If this is on a podcast form, I don't have a way of you communicating with me, so check us out on YouTube, I suppose. That is the first part of the double feature here, and so now I am going to go get some water because I've been talking a lot, and again, this is something I'm not used to, and I am going to make sort of an invisible cut here in which I will now start with the second part of the double feature. So more in a moment, but thanks for listening to the review of Scarface. So my timing was pretty off with this transition. It was going to be really cool, I promise. So enjoy this black screen for another few seconds before we get to the next part of the podcast. All right, so the second part of this double feature is a movie that was new to me first time watching, even though it came out in December of 2022. I didn't watch it until 2023. And this movie, of course, is Godzilla Minus One. I can't say I'm all too familiar with the monster franchise or any monster movie. It's not really the type of movie that I watch, so going to see this is not exactly my first choice, but my friends wanted to go see it, and who was I to say no? In fact, my friend had seen it the night before and liked it so much that he had to go see it again. Now, there was certainly a lot of buzz online regarding this movie and how great of a film it was for the small budget that it had, and that was definitely enough for me to get my interest piqued, but I probably would have watched it on a streaming service at some point. But really, looking back on it, I'm very happy that I saw it in theaters because it was definitely a sight to behold, especially considering the budget was a lot less than the $15 million that was originally reported. Sure, there are some scenes here and there that look kind of iffy, but those are few and far between as far as I'm considered. The special effects in this movie, for the amount of budget that it had, whatever it really is pretty fantastic. Godzilla, I'm not a Godzilla purist. I have no idea what Godzilla is supposed to look like, but he looked really good in this. Between the scales on his back and the laser beam that he fires, I mean, whew, it looked really good. Really, really good on the screen. I think the reason this movie was so digestible for me, someone who's not a monster movie fan, is because it's really not that much of a monster movie. Sure, we do get to see Godzilla within the first 10 minutes of the movie, which was a big shock to me. I didn't expect him to come in until maybe 45 to an hour into the movie. But the movie itself focuses on the main characters and their relationships to one another more than it does Godzilla. The main man, the leading man, is a failed kamikaze pilot and has to deal with the fallout of not succeeding on his mission and the dishonor that he brings to both himself and his family because he did not go through with his job. Couple this with the people around him who are surviving the remnants of World War II and the bombing that happened in their city, and we have a story that's more about the human condition and what it means to survive than it is a movie about a monster. It's really just a very interesting movie because of the backdrop of history that's here. How did Japan recover after World War II? What was it like once the US and the Soviets began their Cold War, or their start of their Cold War against each other? And how did countries like Japan that were involved in the war fall in between them? Really, I think the biggest part of this movie was the connection between the main character and the woman that he meets in the marketplace with the child. The two of them being a married but not married couple in the rubble of their once created home is something that is really fun to watch, because the two of them want to just make a better place in this city, not necessarily for themselves, but for the child, to make sure that she is able to grow up in a place that is not only built up with walls around them, unlike when the house originally is lived in, but to grow up in a world that is safe, one that she doesn't have to worry about death and destruction, of which both of them have seen so much. Now, I think the other cast of characters that are in this movie are also very fun. The ragtag group that is originally set out to disarm the mines surrounding Tokyo Bay, that being the Doc with his spectacles and long hair, the soldier, not soldier, and the young kid. All four of them on the boat, including the main character in there, are a fun group to engage in, to see what their banter is, with the young kid thinking that he's a soldier and that he can do anything that the other ones do, but really not knowing what it means to participate in war and the costs of it. I think also the perspective of our main character here, where he is tormented by his dreams of what he could have done to stop Godzilla originally on Odo Island. That is something that sticks with him and drives his character forward, knowing that he has to be able to live with that in his life, with the past sins, but also can't continue to look back without looking forward. It's very interesting there. And towards the end of the movie, where they are coming to try to kill Godzilla so that he will spare Tokyo and the rest of Japan, we get the fighter jet, the inverted fighter jet, where they had the propeller in the back of the plane, but that was also the front of the plane. It was a very cool fighter jet, and whether it existed or not, I think it was a very interesting device to use in the movie. I will say, the movie does baby the audience a little bit towards the end of the film, specifically with that fighter jet, in which they show us very well that the plane is not made in Japan. And previous in the movie, we learned that Japanese planes did not have ejector seats. So by seeing that this plane was a German manufactured plane, we know that there is an ejector seat, and it's alluded to that there's an ejector seat, and it's very explicitly hinted at that there's an ejector seat. But once our main character is finally ejected from the plane after flying it into the mouth of Godzilla, we then get a scene of the engineer that survived the Odo Island attacks explaining to him the ejector seat. And I mean, was that really necessary? I don't know. I think people would have understood it without that context being provided. It seems a little silly to include that in there, but if that's what I'm criticizing the movie for, then I'd say it did a pretty decent job. So overall, I think it's a really good watch for someone that has never dabbled in Godzilla before, like myself, because the story is more, as I said before, about humanity and what it means to be human and how you have to deal with the after effects of war. So overall, I gave this movie a 7 out of 10, a 3.5 out of 5. I think it's a pretty solid rating. For the most part with my ratings, anything that's a 6 out of 10, a 3 out of 5, those or above, those are all good movies. So a 7 out of 10, that movie is pretty good. And that means, yeah, I really enjoyed this thing. I thought it was well done and well directed, especially for a movie with such a low budget. And really, I think the only way that it could have gotten better was maybe if they included less explaining of things and there was a little more dialogue that was cleaned up a little bit. I think it didn't have the smoothest dialogue at times, but to the movie's credit, I think it didn't necessarily need to have the cleanest dialogue. It was more about the story that was unfolding rather than the words that were being said. So overall, yeah, I think it's a movie that's worth checking out. Definitely a movie that you will not be disappointed if you go see. And if you're listening or watching this by the time it is out of theaters, look out for it on streaming, wherever it appears. Supposedly, this movie is going to be the first in a series. So Minus One, we should expect a Godzilla Zero at some point, and that is definitely teased at the end of the movie with the woman still being alive, which I don't really love. I love that the vein on her neck with the radiation from Godzilla or whatever it might be is the reason that she's alive. In building a universe, I suppose things like that need to happen. But if this was a one-off movie, I think that would be really just kind of silly to have brought her back. But they're trying to do something here, so I can respect that and allow it to happen, if you will. So, yeah, Godzilla Minus One, definitely a movie that's worth seeing. Gets a thumbs up from me. But that is going to probably conclude this first podcast here. -5, going on the theme. Podcast number -5. So, I feel like there are some definite rough spots here that need to get ironed out. I'm definitely going to watch the footage, see what went right, what went wrong, but the footage in pretty much its entirety will be uploaded. This audio recording, the exact same thing, will be uploaded, cut together between those two takes. And from there, we'll have to take a look and see what works out for the next one. But until then, I want you to stay tuned and welcome to Film Muse.